The wind is rising across the Great Plains tonight, carrying with it the memory of storms that moved like living things across an endless white horizon. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the reach of electric light and insulated walls, there exists a memory of winter so complete, so absolute, that sleep itself became an act of quiet engineering. Have you ever wondered what it meant to close your eyes when the only thing separating you from a blizzard was buffalo hide stretched across wooden poles? What did rest feel like when thunder crashed above your head and hail drummed against leather walls with the rhythm of 1,000 anxious fingers? How did families find warmth in the heart of winter when the prairie offered nothing but wind and snow and the vast indifference of open sky? Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before central heating, before weather forecasts, before the comforting hum of modern shelter. We're stepping into the world of the Northern Plains peoples, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Blackfoot, communities who made their winter camps along frozen rivers and learned to sleep through storms that could shred, hide, and snap lodge poles like kindling. The tipi stands in your mind now, a pale cone against darkness, smoke rising from its crown like a prayer dissolving into snow-heavy clouds. Inside, a fire flickers low, casting copper shadows across the curved walls. Children sleep pressed against their parents, wrapped in buffalo robes that smell of smoke and animal warmth. Outside, the world is preparing to test every lashing, every stake, every carefully positioned smoke flap. If these quiet journeys into history help you unwind at the end of your day, you're welcome to like and subscribe. No pressure, just a gentle way to let me know these stories matter to you. If you're listening right now, wherever you are in the world, feel free to share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Thank you for being here, for letting history slow your thoughts, for giving yourself permission to simply listen. Now let the outside world fade a little further. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Settle deeper into whatever soft place holds you tonight. We're about to enter a teepee on the coldest night of winter, just as the first hailstones begin to fall, and we're going to understand, really understand, what it meant to sleep when survival and rest were the same fragile thing. The year doesn't matter as much as the season. What matters is the north wind, the snow drifting against lodge walls, and the rhythm of breath visible in the frozen air. You are tired, bone tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from a day spent moving through deep snow. Your legs ache from the morning's journey to gather firewood, your fingers are stiff from scraping ice off hides, and your back carries the dull throb of hours bent over tasks that must be done before darkness falls. This is winter camp, positioned in a river valley where cottonwood trees offer some buffer against the wind, where water, though frozen, lies close enough to reach without risking exposure on the open plain. The sun has set, and with it, the temperature has dropped so sharply you can feel it in your teeth. Your breath forms clouds that hang in the air for a moment before dissipating into the greater cold. You've spent the last hour of daylight clearing snow from around the base of your family's teepee, packing it deliberately against the hide walls to create a barrier. Not much of one, but enough to slow the wind that will come searching for gaps in the night. Inside the lodge, the air is thick and layered. Near the fire, there's warmth, almost too much warmth, the kind that makes your face flush and your eyes water from smoke. 3 feet away from the flames, the air grows noticeably cooler, and by the time you reach the outer wall where the sleeping robes are arranged, the cold radiates up from the ground with patient insistence. The floor beneath you is earth, covered with a layer of dried grass, then cedar boughs, then your sleeping robes. Buffalo hide with the fur turned inward, heavy and slightly damp from the breath of previous nights. The teepee is not large, perhaps 15 feet across at its widest point. 7 lodge poles stretch upward to meet at the apex, their tips protruding through the smoke hole that remains perpetually open to the sky, a necessary gap that allows smoke to escape but also admits wind, snow, and the penetrating cold of winter nights. During summer, this opening is a blessing, a source of ventilation and light. In winter, it becomes a compromise, a calculated loss of heat in exchange for breathable air. Around you, the tipi's interior holds your family and their small world of necessary things. Hide bags hang from the lodge poles containing dried meat, herbs, tools, and the small precious items that make life more than mere survival. Your mother's sewing materials rest near her sleeping place, awls made of bone, sinew thread, strips of softened hide waiting to be worked into moccasins or patches for the outer covering. Your father's weapons lean against the frame near the entrance, within easy reach should anything, animal or human, approach in the night. The fire at the center is small now, deliberately reduced as the household prepares for sleep. Too large a fire wastes precious wood and creates dangerous heat that causes heavy sweating beneath the robes, and sweat in winter is a death sentence. Moisture that freezes, that draws warmth from your body with ruthless efficiency. The wood burning now is cottonwood, slow and steady, producing less heat than willow, but lasting longer through the night. The flames cast restless shadows that climb the curved walls, making the painted symbols and geometric patterns seem to move with a life of their own. You can smell everything in this enclosed space. Smoke, always smoke, a scent so constant it has ceased to register as remarkable. Juniper and cottonwood burning, releasing their particular fragrances into the air. Beneath that, the smell of rendered fat used to waterproof seams and to soften hide. The animal smell of the buffalo robes, not unpleasant but thick and present. The faint, sweet scent of dried grass beneath the bedding. And under everything, the smell of humans living in close quarters, breath, sweat, bodies that cannot be washed often in winter's cruel temperatures. Outside, the wind is rising. You've been aware of it for the past hour, the way it announces itself through sound before you feel its full force. First comes the distant rushing, like water moving through a faraway canyon. Then the temperature drops another degree, then another. Your father glances toward the entrance, where the hide door cover is lashed tight against its frame. His expression is neutral, but you recognize the slight tightening around his eyes. He's listening, reading the storm the way you would read a face. Your mother is moving around the tipi's interior with practiced efficiency, her movements economical and silent. She adjusts the bedding, pulling it slightly closer to the fire without blocking the heat's path to the outer edges where the children will sleep. She checks the smoke flaps, 2 wing-like extensions of hide that project from the smoke hole, adjustable from inside the tipi using long poles. These flaps are crucial tonight. Positioned correctly, they'll create a draft that pulls smoke upward and out. Positioned incorrectly, they'll trap smoke inside the lodge, filling the air with choking vapor that makes sleep impossible and potentially deadly. The wind shifts direction. Your mother immediately adjusts the smoke flaps using the poles to reorient the wings to match the new wind angle. It's a delicate calibration, one she's performed thousands of times, reading the wind by sound and feel, by the way the fire flames lean and by the movement of smoke in the air. Too closed and the smoke fills the lodge. Too open and snow and wind pour through the gap, extinguishing the fire and filling the tipi with killing cold. You begin to undress for sleep, but undressing in winter is not the same as summer's luxury. You remove your outer moccasins but keep your inner foot wrappings. You loosen your leather leggings but do not remove them entirely. Your shirt stays on, and over it you'll pull the buffalo robe that serves as your blanket, your mattress, your only barrier against the cold that will seep up from the frozen ground beneath you. You've learned to keep your clothing nearby within arm's reach, because if the fire dies in the night, or if wind tears at the lodge, you'll need to dress quickly, still half asleep, your fingers fumbling with ties and laces in the dark. Your sleeping place is between your siblings, near the outer wall but not against it. The coldest positions are at the very edge, where the hide wall transmits the outside temperature, with barely any buffer. The warmest positions are closest to the fire, but these are reserved for the youngest children and the elders, those most vulnerable to cold, whose bodies cannot generate heat as efficiently. You, being young and strong, are expected to endure the moderate cold of the middle distance. You slide beneath your buffalo robe and immediately feel the shock of cold hide against your skin. The robe has been lying in the teepee's outer zone all day, absorbing the ambient temperature, and now it radiates that cold back at you. You curl into yourself, drawing your knees toward your chest, wrapping your arms around your torso, breathing into the space between your body and the robe, trying to warm the air trapped there with your own heat. Slowly, slowly, the robe begins to warm. But it will never be truly warm, not like summer's easy heat. It will become tolerable, survivable, a state of less cold that passes for comfort only because you have no better option. The first hailstones strike the teepee with a sound like thrown pebbles. They're small at first, no larger than seeds, rattling against the hide with a dry, pattering rhythm. Your mother looks up at the sound, her face illuminated by firelight, and you see her calculating, weighing risks. Hail means ice, means moisture, means potential damage to the outer covering. If the stones are large enough, they can puncture the hide, small tears that grow larger with wind and time, admitting deadly drafts that can transform a survivable night into a crisis. The hailstones grow larger. Now they strike with deeper, more resonant thuds, each impact creating a brief tension in the hide walls that you can see from inside, the material flexing inward slightly, then bouncing back. The sound is irregular, chaotic, 1,000 drummers with no shared rhythm. It's the kind of sound that makes sleep difficult even when you're exhausted, because somewhere in your animal brain you register it as danger, as something requiring attention and response. Your younger sister begins to cry softly. She's only 7 winters old, and storms still frighten her in a way they no longer frighten you. Your mother pulls the child closer, wrapping her in the same robe, sharing body heat and presence. She murmurs something you can't quite hear, words or song you're not sure, and gradually the crying subsides into sniffles, then into the deep breathing of exhausted sleep. This is a skill your mother possesses, this ability to radiate calm even when circumstances argue for fear. The wind increases. Now it's not just blowing, it's howling, a sound that transforms the prairie into a living thing with a voice. The teepee begins to sway just slightly, the lodge poles flexing against the wind's pressure. This is normal, expected even. The teepee's conical shape is designed to shed wind, to present minimal resistance, to bend rather than break. But knowing this intellectually doesn't stop your body from tensing each time a particularly strong gust strikes, doesn't prevent the small voice in your mind from wondering if tonight will be the night the storm is too strong, if the stakes will pull free from the frozen ground, if the entire structure will collapse inward, trapping you beneath heavy hides and wooden poles. Thunder rolls across the sky, distant but moving closer. You count the seconds between lightning flash and thunder crash the way your grandmother taught you, estimating how many miles separate you from the storm's heart. 5 seconds, 4 seconds, 3. The storm is approaching fast, driven by the north wind that brings the coldest air, the deepest snows, the most dangerous weather of the winter season. Lightning flashes outside, visible through the smoke hole, as a brief, brilliant illumination that turns everything inside the teepee into stark shadows and white light. For that instant, you can see every detail, the texture of the hide walls, the grain of the lodge poles, the faces of your family members, and then it's gone, and the darkness returns more completely than before, your eyes struggling to readjust to the firelight's dimmer glow. The thunder that follows is immediate, a crack so loud it seems to split the sky directly overhead. Your sister wakes with a start, crying out, and even your father flinches, a tiny movement, quickly controlled, but a flinch nonetheless. Thunder this close means the storm is upon you now, means lightning is striking the prairie with enough force to split trees, to kill animals, to set the dry grass of autumn ablaze, if this were any season but winter. Your mother moves again, checking the smoke flaps, adjusting them to prevent the sudden wind shifts that accompany thunderstorms. One of your brothers, older, responsible, rises without being asked and adds 2 pieces of wood to the fire, building it up slightly to compensate for the cold air now pouring through the smoke hole. This is the constant negotiation of winter tipi life versus cold, smoke versus breathable air, light versus darkness, warmth versus survival. The hide door cover flaps violently against its lashings, and your father moves to reinforce it, adding an extra tie to keep it secure. Through the gap, before he pulls it tight, you glimpse the world outside, a chaos of wind and hail and snow, everything moving horizontally, the storm so complete you cannot see more than a few feet into the darkness. Then the door is secured again, and you are enclosed, contained, held inside this small cone of relative safety, while the prairie tears at itself in fury. Sleep seems impossible now, but your body disagrees. You are so tired, and the warmth building beneath your robe is so seductive, and the sound of the storm is so overwhelming that it becomes almost hypnotic. White noise that drowns out thought, that reduces everything to the simple fact of survival, of breath, of the fire's steady glow. Your eyes grow heavy despite the noise, despite the cold seeping through the hide walls, despite the knowledge that this night is far from over. But sleep will not be continuous, will not be restful in any modern sense. Every hour someone will need to tend the fire, adding wood to maintain the coals, adjusting the positioning to ensure efficient burning. Every time the wind shifts, the smoke flaps will need adjustment, or the teepee will fill with choking vapor that jolts everyone awake, coughing and gasping. If snow begins to pile against the walls, someone will need to go outside and clear it, preventing the build-up that can cause structural collapse or create ice dams that trap moisture inside the lodge. You drift into a light doze, not quite sleep, but not quite waking either. You're aware of the fire's warmth on your face, of the cold at your back, of your brother's body pressed against yours, not for affection, but for warmth, for survival, sharing heat in the most practical way possible. You're aware of the storm's rhythm, the way it surges and subsides, like the breathing of some immense creature that has swallowed the world. Sometime in the night, you've lost track of time, have no way to measure its passage, except by the vague sense of how many times you've drifted off and been jolted awake. Your father shakes your shoulder. It's your turn to maintain the fire. You don't want to leave the cocoon of your robe, don't want to expose yourself to the cold air, but you do, because this is the bargain of winter survival. Everyone contributes, everyone sacrifices, everyone endures. You slide out from beneath the robe and immediately feel the cold like a physical blow. The air near the floor is frigid, so cold it makes your joints ache as you crawl toward the fire. You add wood carefully, placing it to catch the existing coals, blowing softly to encourage the flames without creating sparks that might set the hide walls smoking. The fire responds, growing slightly, pushing back the darkness by a few feet. While you're awake, you notice the hide walls are covered with a thin layer of frost on their interior surface. This is condensation from breath, from the moisture of 8 humans breathing in a confined space, freezing on contact with the cold hide. By morning, this frost will melt as the sun warms the exterior, creating a damp environment that never quite dries, that keeps everything slightly wet, slightly cold, slightly uncomfortable. This is part of winter tipi life that no one speaks of much, the constant dampness, the way everything feels clammy and cold and never truly dry. You crawl back to your robe and slide beneath it. The cold has penetrated the hide during your absence, and now you must warm it again, must endure again that initial shock of icy material against your skin. You curl up, shivering, waiting for your body heat to work its slow magic, and eventually, you drift back into something like sleep. The hail has stopped, but now snow is falling. You can hear the difference in sound, the softer whisper of flakes against hide instead of the hard rattle of ice. Snow is better than hail in many ways. It doesn't damage the covering, and it actually adds insulation as it piles up. But snow brings its own dangers. Too much snow can collapse the structure, can bury the entrance, can trap you inside with no way to replenish firewood or water. Lightning flashes again, and thunder follows, but farther away now. The storm is moving east, chasing the dawn that must be coming soon, though in the darkness of the teepee you have no way to know how close morning might be. All you know is that you've survived another hour and then another, and that each hour of survival is its own small victory. Your muscles ache from the tension of cold, from holding yourself in a curled position for so long. Your feet are numb, despite being wrapped in fur-lined moccasins and buried beneath the robe. Your fingers tingle with that peculiar combination of cold and poor circulation. Your face is hot from the fire on one side, cold from the air on the other, creating an uncomfortable split sensation that makes it difficult to find a restful position. But you do sleep in fragments, in stolen moments between fire tending and storm sounds. You sleep the way humans have slept for thousands of winters, without certainty, without comfort, but with the stubborn insistence of a body that needs rest regardless of circumstances. You sleep with one part of your mind always listening, always alert for the sound that means danger, the crack of a breaking pole, the rush of wind through a torn hide, the cry of a child in distress. And in those fragments of sleep, you dream. You dream of summer, of warm days when the teepee door stood open and sun poured through the smoke hole like liquid gold. You dream of gathering berries with your sister, of swimming in the river when the water was warm and lazy, of lying in tall grass watching clouds shape themselves into buffalo and birds. These dreams are gifts, small escapes from the reality of winter's grip, and when you wake from them, the cold seems even more bitter by contrast. Somewhere in the deepest part of night, the storm's fury begins to subside. The wind drops from a howl to a moan, from a moan to a whisper. The thunder grows distant, then stops entirely. The snow continues to fall, but gently now, without wind, to drive it horizontal, simply descending from the sky in that slow, patient way that can continue for days without dramatic effect, but with cumulative consequence. You wake in what you think might be early morning, though the darkness inside the teepee gives no indication of time. Your father is awake. You can tell by his breathing, by the way he's lying still but alert. He's listening to the storm's absence, assessing, planning the day's work that will begin as soon as there's enough light to see. Snow will need to be cleared. The hides will need checking for damage. Firewood will need to be gathered. Water will need to be carried from the river if the river hasn't frozen solid. Life will continue because there's no alternative, because stopping means death, because Survival is a choice you make with every action, every hour, every cold morning when you force yourself to leave the minimal warmth of your robes and face another day. This is why it sucked to sleep in a teepee during winter storms. Not because of any single dramatic moment of danger, though those existed, but because of the grinding, relentless nature of discomfort. Because warmth was always temporary, always threatened, always requiring attention and maintenance, because privacy didn't exist and personal space didn't exist, and the simple act of staying alive required the participation of every family member in an endless rotation of tasks, because you could never fully relax, never fully surrender to rest, never trust that the storm wouldn't worsen, that the fire wouldn't die, that the cold wouldn't find a way through your defenses. Because even success, making it through the night, brought no guarantee that the next night wouldn't be worse, that the winter wouldn't deepen, that the storms wouldn't continue until the food ran out, or the firewood was exhausted, or someone made a mistake that cost them their fingers or toes or life. This was sleep as survival, rest as strategy, night as a battlefield where the enemy was cold and wind and the slow erosion of human endurance. And yet people survived. Not just survived, but lived, loved, raised children, told stories, maintained cultures, adapted and innovated and persisted through winters that would kill unprepared humans in hours. The light is changing now. You can sense it even before you can see it. The darkness inside the teepee is shifting from absolute black to dark grey, that first hint of dawn that means you've made it through another night. Outside, the storm has passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Snow drifted against the northern sides of tipis, covering the remains of last night's fire pits, burying the paths between lodges. The sky is clearing, stars visible now between tattered clouds, and in the east the faintest suggestion of approaching day. You made it, your family made it. The teepee stood, the fire survived, and now another day begins. Her name was Watiwi, which meant dancing girl in the language of her people, though by the winter of her 35th year she rarely danced. Not because she had lost joy, she hadn't, but because dance is a luxury of warm seasons, of gatherings when food is abundant and work is light. Winter demanded different movements, the practical motions of survival, the careful choreography of fire tending and hide mending and child rearing in spaces too small for anything but necessary action. She was known, though not famous, known for the quality of her hide work, for seams that didn't leak, for repair patches that held through storms that tore lesser work to shreds. Known for her silence, not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but the silence of someone who understood that words were tools to be used precisely, without waste. Known for her hands, which moved with the certainty of long practice, which could tie complex knots in darkness, which could read the texture of leather and know by touch alone whether it needed more smoking or more working or more fat rubbing to achieve the perfect flexibility that meant the difference between life and death in winter wind. The winter camp sat in a bowl of land where a tributary creek fed into the Missouri River, both waterways locked now beneath ice, so thick you could walk a horse across without fear. The camp had been established in early autumn, before the first snows, in a location chosen for its strategic advantages. The creek valley provided shelter from the worst winds that swept across the open prairie. Cottonwood trees grew thick along the banks, offering firewood that, while not ideal, was abundant and close. And the river, though frozen, remained a known water source. You could chop through the ice with stone axes and dippers, reaching the liquid flow that continued beneath winter's seal. It was late in the moon of frost in the teepee, the darkest part of winter when the sun seemed to have forgotten the northern lands entirely. The hunting party, 15 men including Watiwi's husband and 2 of her brothers, had left 5 days earlier following signs of buffalo that scouts had reported moving south from the hills. This was not unusual. Winter hunting happened whenever opportunity presented itself, whenever the herd's movement brought them close enough to make the dangerous journey worthwhile. What was unusual was the timing, so close to a storm that any experienced person could read in the sky, in the behavior of animals, in the quality of light and air. But buffalo didn't care about human convenience. The herd was moving, and the camp's meat supply was running low, and so the men had gone, leaving behind a camp of women, children, and the few elders too old for winter hunts. This meant additional responsibility for those who remained, meant reorganizing the division of labor to cover all necessary tasks without the men's strength and numbers. Watiwi had noticed the storm's approach 2 days before it arrived. The signs were there for anyone trained to read them. A pale ring appeared around the moon, perfectly circular, the kind that predicted moisture in the air. The camp's dogs grew restless, whining and pacing despite having been fed. The horses, normally placid in winter's cold, clustered together more tightly than usual, their breath forming a communal cloud of vapor. And the temperature, which had been holding steady for weeks, suddenly dropped, not gradually, but sharply, as if a door had opened in the sky and let in air from some colder realm beyond human knowledge. She said nothing about these observations. Everyone in camp had seen the same signs, had made the same calculations. Instead, she simply began preparing, working through a mental list of tasks that needed completion before the storm arrived. She checked every seam of her family's teepee, running her fingers along the joins where hide met hide, feeling for any separation, any weakness that might admit wind. She found 3 spots that needed attention, not failures yet, but places where stress had begun to pull the stitching loose, and she repaired them with fresh sinew, working the thread through holes she'd all punched years ago, holes that aligned perfectly because she'd measured them with tools and patience. She gathered additional firewood, more than she thought they'd need, because you never regretted having too much fuel, but frequently regretted having too little. She arranged it carefully inside the teepee, stacking it in a dry corner, away from the fire pit, but close enough to remain accessible in darkness. She checked the firestones, smooth river rocks that held heat, and repositioned them for maximum efficiency, creating a ring that would reflect warmth inward rather than allowing it to disperse toward the outer walls. She inspected the bedding piece by piece. Buffalo robes that showed signs of thinning were doubled, 2 layers instead of 1, creating better insulation. Cedar boughs were refreshed, the old ones, now dry and crushed, replaced with newer cuttings that retained their aromatic oils. These helped repel moisture and added a pleasant scent to the constantly smoky air. She arranged the sleeping places in a deliberate pattern, ensuring that the youngest children and her mother-in-law, who was 64 winters old and increasingly frail, would sleep closest to the fire. The storm announced itself properly on the evening of the 2nd day after the signs first appeared. The temperature, already cold, plummeted so quickly that exposed skin burned within seconds. The wind arrived not gradually but all at once, as if someone had struck the prairie with an enormous hand, and within an hour the world beyond the teepee entrance had become invisible, erased by wind-driven snow that moved horizontally, parallel to the ground. Watiwi had already secured the door covering, lashing it tight with leather thongs, and had adjusted the smoke flaps to their winter storm position, angled to prevent downdrafts while still allowing smoke to escape. She had done this hundreds of times, perhaps thousands, and her hands moved through the process with the automatic certainty of breath or heartbeat. Inside the teepee, her 3 children sat quietly near the fire. The oldest, a boy of 13 winters, was old enough to understand the seriousness of storms, old enough to help with fire maintenance and to watch his younger siblings. The middle child, a girl of 9 winters, sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes wide but calm, trusting that the adults would manage whatever came. The youngest, a boy of 4 winters, dozed against his grandmother, his face pressed into her side, unaware or uncaring that the world outside had become dangerous. Watiwi's mother-in-law, Winona, sat in her place of honor near the fire's warmest edge. She was a woman who had survived 64 winters, who had raised 6 children to adulthood, a remarkable achievement in a world where half of all children died before their 10th year. Her hands, twisted now, with the joint pain that came to many in old age, still held needlework, still moved slowly but surely through the task of creating winter moccasins. She didn't speak often anymore, had grown quiet in her later years, but when she did speak, people listened because she'd earned the right to be heard. The hail came first, as it often did with these storms. Ice formed high in the clouds, growing in layers like strange fruit, falling when it became too heavy for the wind to hold aloft. The first stones were small, no bigger than berry pits, and they struck the hide covering with a dry, rattling sound that was more irritating than alarming. But hail was unpredictable. Stones that started small could return to the clouds multiple times, adding layers of ice until they grew to the size of eggs or even fists, and those larger stones could puncture hide, could injure or kill anyone caught outside, could shatter bone and break skulls. The children looked up at the sound, their faces showing concern. Watiwi's oldest son glanced at her, waiting for some signal, some indication of how worried he should be. She met his eyes and allowed herself the smallest smile, a barely perceptible softening of her expression that said, "This is manageable. This is normal. We are safe." And she saw him relax slightly, saw the tension in his shoulders ease, and she felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had passed on calm when she could have transmitted fear. The hail grew larger. Now each stone made a distinct thud as it struck, and you could hear them hitting in waves, following the wind's gusts, a sudden flurry of impacts, then a lull, then another flurry. The hide walls flexed inward with each strike, the material absorbing the energy and bouncing back, testament to the tipi's design, to the flexibility that made it more durable than any rigid structure could be in this climate. Then came the lightning. It announced itself first with a flash, so bright it penetrated the hide walls, turning the tipi's interior from amber firelight to brief, brilliant white. For that instant, Watiwi could see every detail with unnatural clarity. The individual hairs in the buffalo robes, the texture of the smoke rising from the fire, the wide eyes of her children frozen in expressions of surprise and fear. The thunder followed several seconds later, a long, rolling crash that seemed to travel across the entire sky, from one horizon to the other, like the voice of something immense and incomprehensible. The children flinched. Even Watiwi felt her body tense involuntarily, felt the ancient animal part of her brain respond to a sound that signified danger, that warned of power beyond human control or understanding. But she did not allow that tension to show in her voice. "Wakinyan," she said quietly, naming the thunder beings, the spirits who rode the storms and spoke in lightning and thunder. "They are traveling tonight. We will be respectful and quiet, and they will pass over us without harm." This was not empty superstition, not the primitive belief that modern people might imagine. It was practical psychology, a way to contextualize danger, to give her children a framework for understanding without being paralyzed by fear. The thunder beings were real in the sense that all living things are real. They were the storm itself, personified, given identity and purpose. And by speaking of them respectfully, by acknowledging their power while maintaining calm, she was teaching her children how to exist in a world where forces beyond human control were constant companions. Winona nodded from her place by the fire, her old eyes reflecting the flames. "I remember the storm when I was a girl," she said, her voice soft but carrying. "Lightning struck so close the thunder had no delay. It split a pine tree outside our camp, and the next morning we found the tree's heart turned to splinters. But we were unharmed because we had shown respect, had remained quiet and humble while the Wakinyan did their work." This was how knowledge passed, not through formal instruction but through story, through the casual mention of past events that carried within them lessons about survival, about proper behavior, about the way the world worked. The children listened, their fear transforming into fascination, and Watiwi saw this transformation and was satisfied. But then the wind shifted suddenly, a violent change of direction that came without warning. The smoke flaps, perfectly positioned for the north wind, were now wrong for this new easterly gust, and immediately the teepee began filling with smoke. Not gradually, but quickly, the acrid grey vapour pouring down from the smoke hole instead of being drawn upward and out, filling the upper half of the teepee's interior, making everyone's eyes water and throats burn. The children began coughing. Watiwi's youngest son woke with a start, crying out in distress, pressing his face against his grandmother's side, trying to escape the smoke, but finding no escape. This was dangerous, genuinely dangerous. Smoke inhalation in a confined space could kill more surely than cold, could suffocate or cause damage to lungs that would weaken a person for the rest of their shortened life. Watiwi moved immediately, not panicking but with swift precision. She grabbed the adjusting poles, long sticks that hooked into the smoke flaps' wing bones, allowing someone inside to reposition the flaps without going outside. She pulled the left flap closed, pushing the right one open wider, trying to create a new pattern of airflow that would pull the smoke up and out instead of down and in. The smoke continued to pour in. Her adjustment hadn't worked. The wind was too chaotic, coming from multiple directions now as the storm structure broke down into turbulent confusion. She needed to try a different approach. "Winona," she said, her voice steady despite the urgency of the situation, "tell me when the smoke thins." Winona nodded, understanding immediately what Watiwi intended. The older woman would watch the smoke's behavior while Watiwi manipulated the flaps, providing feedback that Watiwi herself couldn't see from her position near the smoke hole's adjusting poles. Watiwi pulled both flaps partially closed, reducing the opening to a narrow slit. For a moment, the smoke thickened even more, and she heard her daughter cough violently, heard her youngest son's cries grow more distressed. But she held steady, counting 3 breaths, then shifted the flaps again, angling them differently, creating an asymmetrical opening that caught the chaotic wind and somehow, miraculously, channeled it correctly. "Better," Winona said, her voice calm despite the strain of breathing smoke-laden air. "The smoke is rising now." Watiwi adjusted the flaps one more increment, fine-tuning the angle, and the smoke began to clear perceptibly. First the upper portion of the teepee, then gradually the middle layers, until finally the air near the floor was breathable again, relatively clear except for the normal haze that always existed in winter lodges. The children's coughing subsided. Her youngest son's cries faded back into whimpering, then quiet. But Watiwi's work wasn't finished. She turned her attention to the fire itself, which had grown too large in her absence. Her oldest son had added wood, while she was managing the smoke flaps, trying to help, but not yet experienced enough to know that during smoke problems, you reduce the fire rather than building it up. More fire meant more smoke, meant more danger, meant compounding the very problem you were trying to solve. She moved to the fire pit and carefully removed 2 of the burning logs, setting them aside on the earth where they would continue to smoulder, but produce less active flame. Then she took a piece of damp bark, kept near the fire for exactly this purpose, and laid it across part of the remaining fire, partially smothering it, reducing its heat output without extinguishing it entirely. The flames dropped, the smoke production decreased, and the balance she'd been seeking finally established itself. Then the real crisis came. The wind found a weakness in the teepee's covering, not one of the seams Watiwi had checked, but a spot where the original hide had been damaged months ago and patched, and where that patch, subjected to repeated cycles of freezing and thawing, had worked partially loose. The wind drove through this small opening like water through a crack in a dam, and the cold that entered was so immediate and so intense that everyone felt it, felt the temperature inside the teepee plummet as the carefully maintained warmth bled out through this unexpected breach. Worse, the wind created a whistling sound, a high-pitched keening that set teeth on edge and made concentration difficult. And worst of all, it was driving snow through the gap, depositing it inside the teepee where it would melt from the fire's heat, creating moisture, creating dampness, creating conditions for hypothermia even inside their shelter. Watiwi knew exactly where the breach was. She could pinpoint it by sound and by the direction of the cold wind's flow. It was low on the northwest wall, perhaps 3 feet from the ground, in a section that would be difficult to reach from inside without moving sleeping robes and stored materials. And it was on the side currently taking the full force of the storm's fury, which meant any exterior repair would expose her to the worst conditions. But there was no choice. The breach would only worsen if left unattended. The wind would work at it, enlarge it, and by morning they might be facing a tier so large the teepee would be uninhabitable. She would have to go outside and repair it now, in the dark, in the storm, in conditions that could kill an unprepared person in less time than it took to smoke a pipe. She moved to her supply of materials, selecting what she would need. A piece of hide, cut roughly to size, large enough to cover the damaged area with overlap on all sides. Sinew thread, pre-soaked, so it would swell when it dried, creating a watertight seal, a bone awl for punching new holes, and leather thongs to lash the patch in place temporarily while she worked the more permanent sinew stitching. She dressed as warmly as possible, adding extra layers that would slow her movements but might prevent frostbite. Heavy winter moccasins lined with rabbit fur. Leather leggings reinforced with a second layer. A buffalo robe worn cape-style over her shoulders, tied at her throat. Mittens made from bear fur, with the guard hairs left on to shed snow and ice. Her oldest son watched her prepare, understanding what she was about to do, his face showing worry he was trying to conceal. "I should come with you," he said, and she heard in his voice the desire to prove himself, to take on adult responsibility, to protect his mother. "You will maintain the fire," she told him, not unkindly. "That is your work tonight. Keep it steady, not too large, not too small. Watch the smoke flaps. If the wind shifts again, adjust them. This is equally important to what I will do outside." He nodded, accepting this, and she saw him straighten slightly, saw him take on the mantle of temporary household authority in his father's absence. He was learning, this boy, learning the things he would need to know when he established his own family, his own teepee, his own responsibilities. Watiwi moved to the entrance and began unlashing the door covering. The moment she loosened the first tie, wind forced its way through the gap, carrying snow and cold and the roaring sound of the storm's full voice. She worked quickly, opening just enough space to slip through, then pulling the door closed behind her as her daughter rushed forward to relash it from the inside. Outside was chaos. The wind struck her like a physical blow, driving snow into her face with such force that it stung exposed skin, that made breathing difficult, that made seeing nearly impossible. The world beyond her immediate vicinity simply didn't exist. There was only white, only wind, only the roaring sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that filled her ears and made thought difficult. She oriented herself by touch, running her hand along the teepee's exterior surface, counting her steps, measuring distance with her body's memory of the lodge's dimensions. She moved in the direction of the breach, shuffling through snow that was already knee-deep in places, drifted by wind into patterns that bore no relationship to the underlying ground's topology. The cold was extraordinary. Within seconds, she could feel it penetrating her layers, finding the gaps between hide and skin, between mittens and wrists, between moccasins and leggings. Her face began to go numb, the skin losing sensation in that way that presaged frostbite if exposure continued too long. Her eyes watered from the wind, and the tears froze on her cheeks, creating tiny lines of ice that pulled at her skin. She found the breach by the sound it made, that whistling keen that cut through even the storm's roar. Up close, she could see the damage was worse than she'd thought. The patch hadn't just worked loose, it had torn partially free, leaving a flapping section of hide that the wind caught and pulled, threatening to enlarge the tear with every gust. She positioned herself to block the wind as much as possible, using her body as a buffer, and set to work. Her hands were already growing clumsy with cold, the fine motor control necessary for detailed work beginning to fail. She fumbled with the awl, nearly dropped it, caught it again, and forced her fingers to maintain their grip. The hail returned, larger stones now, and they struck her back and shoulders with bruising force. Each impact was a small violence, a reminder that she was completely exposed, that the storm was indifferent to her survival, that nature would kill her without malice or mercy if she made a mistake or took too long or simply ran out of the warmth her body could generate. She punched holes in the new patch piece, working from memory and feel rather than sight, her face turned away from the wind to preserve what little vision she retained. Then she punched corresponding holes in the teepee's main covering, aligning them with the patch holes, creating a matching pattern that would allow her to lace the two pieces together. Her fingers were losing sensation now. She could see them moving but couldn't quite feel them, couldn't trust that they were doing what her mind commanded. This was the dangerous stage, the point where mistakes happened, where people dropped tools or tied knots incorrectly or simply stopped moving as cold and exhaustion overwhelmed their will to continue. But Watiwi had been cold before. She'd been exhausted before. She'd worked in conditions that defeated comfort and demanded only persistence, only the stubborn refusal to stop until the work was done. So she continued, threading sinew through the holes she'd punched, pulling it tight, moving to the next hole, establishing a stitch pattern that would hold, that would keep the breach sealed, that would protect her family, sleeping on the other side of this thin barrier. The wind gusted, and the force of it knocked her off balance. She fell against the teepee wall, felt the structure give slightly under her weight, then recover. For a moment, she simply stayed there, pressed against the hide, her cheek against the cold material, gathering strength for the final effort. Then she straightened and returned to her work. 3 more stitches, 2 more, 1. She tied off the sinew with a knot her grandmother had taught her, a knot that would hold under tension, that would tighten with stress rather than loosening. She tested the patch with her numb hands, pulling at it, trying to find any give, any weakness. It held. The whistling had stopped. The breach was sealed. She gathered her tools, holding them close to her body so the wind couldn't steal them, and began moving back toward the entrance. The short journey felt immeasurably long. Her legs were stiff, her body was shaking with cold, and the disorientation of the storm made it difficult to judge direction or distance. She shuffled forward, one hand on the teepee's wall, using it as a guide, counting steps, trusting her memory of the lodge's geography. The entrance appeared, or rather, she found it by touch, by the seam where door covering met wall. She scratched at the hide, signaling her presence, and immediately the lashing loosened from inside. Her daughter had been waiting, had been listening for this signal, and now she pulled the door covering aside, just enough for Watiwi to slip through. Inside was warmth. Relative warmth, anyway. It felt like blazing heat after the exterior cold, though by any objective measure it was barely above freezing near the walls, only truly warm within a few feet of the fire. Watiwi's body began shaking more violently as it registered the temperature change, as blood flow increased to her extremities, bringing with it the painful burning sensation that accompanied the return of circulation to frozen tissue. She shed her outer layers, her fingers fumbling with ties and knots, and her oldest son came to help, untying things she couldn't manage with hands that were still too numb to manipulate complex fasteners. He said nothing, didn't ask questions or express relief at her return, but she could see it in his face, could see the worry he'd been holding, and the release of that worry now that she was safe inside again. Winona had warm tea waiting, just hot water with some pine needles for flavor and some claimed medicinal benefit. And Watiwi drank it gratefully, feeling the heat spread through her body, warming her from inside, even as the external warmth of the fire worked on her skin and muscles. The shaking gradually subsided. Sensation returned to her fingers and toes, not pleasantly, but painfully, with that intense tingling that felt like being stabbed with thousands of tiny needles. But she was alive. The breach was sealed. The family was safe. And these were the only things that mattered. She moved to her sleeping place and slid beneath the buffalo robe, still wearing most of her clothing, needing the layers to help her body retain the heat it was trying to generate. Her daughter crawled in beside her, pressing close, sharing warmth without being asked. And her youngest son, woken by the commotion, worked his way under the robe on her other side, his small body radiating surprising heat, his breathing evening out as he found comfort in proximity to his mother. The storm continued through the night, but the crisis had passed. The smoke flaps held their position. The fire burned steadily, maintained by her son, who took his new responsibility seriously, adding wood at careful intervals, keeping the flames at that perfect level that provided heat without waste, light without excessive smoke. And the patch held, the stitching Watiwi had done in darkness and cold, proving sufficient to keep the wind at bay. She didn't sleep, not immediately. She lay there listening to the storm, listening to her children's breathing, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of wind across the prairie. She thought about her husband and brothers out somewhere in this same storm, hoping they'd found shelter, hoping they were safe in their traveling lodge or had taken refuge in some natural formation, a cutbank or a draw where the wind couldn't reach them as fiercely. She thought about the morning to come, about the work that would need doing. The snow would need clearing from the tipi's exterior to prevent collapse. The firestones would need refreshing. The breakfast would need preparing from dried meat and stored roots. And if the hunters returned, she would need to help process whatever game they'd taken, working quickly before the meat froze solid, cutting and preparing and distributing shares according to the complex web of kinship and reciprocal obligation that bound the camp together. But that was tomorrow's concern. Tonight, she had done what needed doing. She had kept her family safe through a storm that might have killed them. Not through heroism, she didn't think of it in those terms, but through competence, through the accumulated knowledge of thousands of nights like this one, through the skills passed down from mother to daughter across generations, through the simple, stubborn refusal to let cold and wind defeat what human ingenuity had built. Eventually, she did sleep. Not deeply, never deeply in winter, but enough to rest, enough to give her body the recovery it needed for the work that tomorrow would bring. And when dawn came, grey and cold but calm, the storm having exhausted itself and moved east toward the river, she rose with everyone else and began the day's tasks, moving through them with the same quiet competence that had carried her through the night. Years later, when she was old and her own grandchildren asked about the hardships of her youth, she would tell them about storms, but not in the way you might expect. She wouldn't dramatize or exaggerate. She would simply describe what happened, what she did, how she solved problems as they arose. And in that simple telling, those grandchildren would understand something important about survival, about competence, about the way humans adapt to circumstances that seem impossible until you've lived through them enough times that they become simply part of life's rhythm. The storm that nearly killed them became just another storm. The night she went out into the blizzard to repair the breach became just another night. And this, perhaps, was the real lesson. Not that heroism was common, but that survival required treating extraordinary danger as ordinary work, something to be managed with skill and patience rather than met with panic or despair. There is something the modern mind struggles to comprehend about the tipi as winter shelter, something that requires us to set aside our assumptions about what makes a dwelling suitable for extreme cold. The difficulty lies not in technical understanding, but in perception itself, in the way contemporary consciousness has been shaped by central heating and insulated walls, by thermostats and weather forecasts, by the assumption that comfort means separation from the elements rather than intelligent negotiation with them. We imagine, perhaps, that indigenous peoples simply endured, that they suffered through winters with primitive technology and made the best of their unfortunate circumstances. This imagination is comfortable because it positions us as advanced, as having progressed beyond such hardship, as living in a present that represents clear improvement over a past defined primarily by its deficiencies. But this understanding is deeply, fundamentally wrong, rooted not in evidence but in the kind of cultural superiority that mistakes difference for deficit. The tipi was not a compromise or a making do, not a shelter people settled for because they lacked the knowledge to build something better. It was an engineered solution to a specific set of problems, refined over centuries of observation and experimentation, evolved through countless iterations until it achieved a kind of perfection appropriate to its purpose. Its conical shape, so simple in appearance that modern observers might dismiss it as primitive, represented sophisticated understanding of aerodynamics. Before that science had a name, before anyone thought to write equations describing how air moves around objects. And the way Plains peoples adapted this structure for winter survival involved knowledge that archaeologists and anthropologists are still working to fully understand. Knowledge embedded not in written texts, but in practice, in the accumulated wisdom of generations who lived and died, testing what worked against what failed. The challenge for modern researchers is not just reconstructing techniques, but recognizing the intelligence behind them, acknowledging that people without laboratories or formal education nonetheless understood principles of thermodynamics and structural engineering with a precision that came from necessity and was validated by survival itself. Consider the basic physics of wind interaction with structures, the forces that come into play when moving air encounters a solid object standing in its path. A rectangular building presents flat surfaces to the wind, creating zones of high and low pressure that can generate enormous stress on walls and roof, forces that must be resisted through structural strength, through walls thick enough and foundations deep enough to withstand sustained assault. Wind hitting a flat surface has nowhere to go but around the edges, and in that forced diversion, it gains speed and turbulence, creating vortices and eddies that multiply the force applied to the structure. But a cone presents no flat surfaces, offers no resistance that must be overcome through force, gives the wind nothing to push against. Wind encountering a conical structure simply deflects, flows around the curve like water around a stone in a stream, continues on its path with minimal energy transfer to the structure itself. The shape does not fight the wind but yields to it, redirects it, transforms what could be destructive force into something that passes by almost without notice. This matters enormously in a prairie environment where wind is not occasional but constant, where a day without wind is so rare it becomes memorable, where the sound of air moving across grass becomes a kind of silence because it never stops. Storms could generate gusts exceeding 60 miles per hour, sustained pressure that continued for hours or days, wind that would quickly destroy any rigid structure not anchored with deep foundations driven into frozen ground. The tipi, by contrast, flexes with the wind, its poles bending slightly like grass stems, its hide covering moving and breathing, its entire structure acting more like a living thing than a static building. There is something almost organic in how a properly erected tipi responds to wind, something that suggests not construction, but growth, as if the shelter had evolved naturally rather than being built deliberately. The poles, cut from straight young trees and carefully selected for their flexibility and strength, bow under pressure but do not break, storing the wind's energy and releasing it gradually as the gust passes. The buffalo hide covering, stretched and staked but not rigid, moves in waves that disperse force rather than concentrating it, that allow the structure to breathe rather than demanding it resist. But the real mystery begins when you examine how plains peoples modified the basic tipi design for winter use, how a shelter that worked admirably in summer became something different, something more complex, when winter's demands required additional adaptation. The summer tipi, already an efficient shelter providing shade from sun and protection from rain, became something that had to hold heat while managing moisture, that had to keep people warm without suffocating them with smoke, that had to remain habitable through blizzards that might last for days. The first and most crucial modification was the addition of a dew cloth or liner, a secondary barrier hung inside the tipi, suspended from the poles several feet from the outer wall, creating an air gap between the two layers. This liner served multiple purposes, though explaining exactly how it worked requires understanding concepts that weren't formally named until modern thermal engineering developed. Concepts like convection and thermal mass and vapor pressure. The air gap between liner and outer wall acted as insulation, yes, creating a buffer zone that slowed heat loss from the occupied interior to the frigid exterior. But it also created something more dynamic, more active than mere dead air space. The system generated a convection current. Air warmed by the fire rose along the inner surface of the liner, traveled up to the smoke hole opening at the tipi's peak, then descended along the inside of the cold outer wall, creating a continuous circulation that drew moisture away from the living space and vented it outside. This circulation prevented condensation from forming on the inner surface where people slept and lived, prevented the accumulation of moisture that would have made the space damp and cold, would have led to ice formation and the gradual degradation of both warmth and comfort. The liner effectively turned the tipi into a passive climate control system, one that required no mechanical energy but functioned continuously as long as the fire burned and temperature differential existed. We know this system existed because we have descriptions of it from early observers, from traders and explorers and eventually anthropologists who lived among plains peoples and recorded what they saw. Surviving photographs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries show the characteristic sagging of liners in winter tipis, the way the fabric hung in specific patterns that suggested something more than mere decoration. And elders in the 20th century remembered and described these techniques to anthropologists who had the wisdom to ask and the patience to listen, who recognized that what they were hearing represented genuine expertise rather than quaint folklore. But what we don't fully understand is how plains peoples discovered this system, how they developed an intuitive understanding of thermal dynamics sophisticated enough to create a passive climate control system without any of the mathematical frameworks that would later explain why it worked. How did someone first realize that a second inner wall would do more than simply add another layer, that the space between walls would create movement, and that movement would solve problems that a simple barrier could not? How did knowledge of optimal spacing develop? The recognition that the gap needed to be wide enough for circulation, but not so wide that it wasted interior space or allowed heat to dissipate uselessly. Some researchers suggest the system was discovered through observation of animal dens, noting how bears and other hibernating animals created spaces with multiple insulating layers, how they used vegetation and their own body heat to create microclimates that remained remarkably stable even as outside temperatures plummeted. Others propose it was simple trial and error, generations of cold nights leading to incremental improvements until the optimal configuration emerged through a process of cultural evolution that mirrored natural selection. But there's a third possibility, one that makes some Western-trained scientists uncomfortable, one that challenges assumptions about the relationship between formal education and genuine understanding. That possibility is that indigenous peoples understood these principles theoretically, that they could conceptualize heat and air movement in ways that didn't require written mathematics but were nonetheless sophisticated and accurate. That they had mental models of how warmth moved through space, how air behaved when heated, how moisture could be managed through deliberate design. That their knowledge was not just empirical, not just, we do this because it works, but conceptual, rooted in genuine understanding of causation and mechanism, even if the vocabulary used to describe that understanding differed from modern technical language. The archaeological evidence is frustratingly incomplete on these questions, insufficient to resolve debates about origins and transmission of knowledge. Tipis left minimal permanent traces, no foundations, no stone walls, nothing that survives millennia, buried in prairie soil exposed to freeze-thaw cycles and erosion and the countless processes that erase the presence of organic materials. What we find instead are fire pits, stone circles that mark tipi locations and held down the hide covering, occasional post holes where wooden stakes once held the structure against wind. And from these minimal remains, from circles of stone and shallow depressions where earth was compacted by years of foot traffic, archaeologists attempt to reconstruct not just how the structures looked, but how they functioned, how people lived inside them, how they managed problems that left no physical trace. It is detective work of a peculiar kind, inference built on absence, conclusions drawn from what is missing as much as from what survives. A particularly dense scatter of stone flakes might suggest a work area where tools were manufactured during long winter hours confined indoors. The size of a fire pit might indicate how many people typically gathered around it. The arrangement of stones in a circle might reveal whether the structure they held down was large or small, designed for a single family or an extended group. The fire pits themselves reveal some information, offering clues about temperature and technique and the daily rhythms of life in winter camps. Many show evidence of stone liners, river rocks arranged in a circle around the burning area, and these stones often display a particular kind of damage, a fracturing pattern that indicates repeated heating and cooling cycles. When stone is heated intensely and then suddenly cooled, perhaps by water spilling on it or snow falling through the smoke hole, its internal structure develops stress fractures. When this happens repeatedly over months or years, when the stone goes through dozens or hundreds of cycles from fire hot to winter cold, the accumulated stress eventually causes the stone to break apart. And the pattern of this breakage can tell researchers something about temperature ranges, about how hot fires burned and how quickly they cooled, about whether they were maintained continuously or allowed to die and then rekindled. Stones that shatter into many small fragments suggest more extreme temperature differentials, more violent stress than stones that crack into a few larger pieces. The location of fractures within the stone can indicate whether heating was even or concentrated. The presence of soot embedded in fracture surfaces can suggest how long the stone remained in use after beginning to fail. Some fire pits show evidence of clay lining, not fired pottery, not ceramics that were deliberately shaped and then hardened in a kiln, but raw clay pressed into the soil and then hardened through repeated exposure to fire over weeks or months. This clay lining would have reduced heat loss into the ground, would have made the fire more efficient by reflecting heat upward and outward into the living space rather than allowing it to sink into cold earth that could absorb warmth endlessly without ever feeling warm itself. A clay-lined pit transformed a fire from something that heated, mainly the air directly above it, into something that radiated warmth more broadly, more effectively. But clay-lined pits are relatively rare in the archaeological record, which raises questions about whether they were a specialized technique used only by certain groups or in certain circumstances, or whether they were more common than the evidence suggests, but have simply failed to survive. Clay exposed to cycles of wetting and drying, freezing and thawing gradually breaks down and becomes indistinguishable from the soil around it. What appears in excavation as simple earth might once have been a carefully maintained clay surface, its purpose now invisible, its existence unrecognized. And then there's the question of fuel management, which sounds mundane but represents a significant challenge in winter prairie environments where cold increases demand for fire at the same time that snow and ice make gathering fuel more difficult. Wood was not abundant on the open plains, not available in the endless supply that forest peoples could take for granted. Cottonwood grew along rivers and streams, its pale bark distinctive even at a distance, but it burns quickly and provides relatively little heat, consumed almost as fast as it can be added to a fire. Willow was common in wet areas but grew in slender stems, small diameter wood that required constant feeding to maintain a fire, that demanded someone's attention through the night unless the family was willing to let the fire die and wake to frozen darkness. Buffalo dung, dried and shaped into chips that could be stacked and stored, burned slowly and steadily but produced less heat than wood and required large quantities to see a family through a winter, quantities that meant weeks of work gathering and preparing fuel before the first snow fell. How did families calculate their fuel needs? How did they estimate what they would require to survive until spring returned and travel became easier? How did they balance the competing demands of staying warm against the labor of gathering fuel and the risk of depleting nearby sources to the point where next year's winter would be even harder? We have some clues from oral histories, from accounts that mention fuel gathering as a major winter activity, from references to conflicts between groups over access to wooded areas along streams and rivers. But we lack the kind of detailed, quantitative information that would allow us to really understand the economics of winter survival. How many pounds of wood or dung per person per day, how far people traveled to gather it, how they made trade-offs between quality and quantity, between wood that gave more heat and dung that was easier to transport. We know that fuel gathering was constant work, that it occupied significant time and energy, that running short was a genuine crisis that could mean death for the elderly or very young. But the precise calculus of survival, the mental arithmetic that families performed in autumn as they prepared for winter, remains largely opaque to us. The relationship between fire management and smoke management adds another layer of complexity, another balance that had to be struck between competing necessities. Too much fire produces too much smoke, creates a volume of combustion byproducts that overwhelms the smoke hole's capacity to vent them, that fills the living space with choking haze. In a confined space, smoke can cause carbon monoxide poisoning, a colorless, odorless gas that binds to hemoglobin more readily than oxygen does, that gradually suffocates victims even as they continue to breathe. Symptoms begin with headache and nausea, easy to dismiss as minor complaints, progress to confusion and loss of coordination, end in unconsciousness and death. Plains peoples would not have understood carbon monoxide in chemical terms, would not have known about hemoglobin binding and oxygen displacement and the precise molecular mechanisms of poisoning. But they certainly understood the phenomenon, understood that bad air from improperly managed fires could kill, that certain conditions made this more likely, that prevention required attention to fire size and smoke flap positioning. The smoke flaps, adjustable triangular extensions at the top of the teepee that could be opened or closed to control draft, required constant management in winter, adjustments made throughout the day and night as wind direction shifted and fire intensity changed. Opening the flaps too wide let cold air pour in, wasted precious heat, made the interior frigid despite the fire's warmth. Closing them too much trapped smoke, created dangerous conditions, forced people to choose between breathing clean air and staying warm. How many people died from this, from carbon monoxide poisoning, in winter teepees when snow blocked ventilation or wind made smoke flap adjustment impossible? We have no way of knowing. Death in a teepee from smoke or cold would leave no distinctive archaeological signature, no unique bone damage or chemical trace that would survive centuries of burial. The deceased would simply result in bodies buried according to cultural practices, their cause of death unknown and unknowable to future researchers excavating graves long after memory of specific individuals had faded. But it must have happened, must have been a known risk, must have been part of the body of knowledge passed from experienced adults to younger generation, how to recognize the signs of bad air, how to correct dangerous conditions before they became fatal, how to balance heat and safety in an environment where both mattered desperately. Parents taught children to watch for certain symptoms, to notice when people became drowsy or confused near the fire, to understand that these signs meant danger rather than mere tiredness. The knowledge was preserved not in written manuals but in stories, in warnings, in the quiet instruction that happened around evening fires when there was time to talk and lessons could be learned without the pressure of immediate crisis. And this brings us to lightning, to thunder, to the spiritual framework that surrounded storms and made them more than simple meteorological events, more than the impersonal collision of weather systems that modern understanding describes. The Plains peoples spoke of thunder beings, Wakinyan in Lakota, similar concepts in other languages and cultures across the grasslands, entities associated with storms and lightning, possessing enormous power and somewhat unpredictable temperaments. These beings were not metaphorical, not symbols representing natural forces in the way modern people might personify nature for poetic effect. They were understood as real, as present, as active agents in the world who could be encountered and who had to be treated with appropriate respect, with the kind of careful behavior one extends to powerful beings whose favor is valuable and whose anger is dangerous. Western observers coming from cultures where religion and science had increasingly separated into distinct domains often categorize these beliefs as primitive superstition, the kind of thing that education and scientific understanding would eventually replace with more accurate knowledge. But this categorization misses something essential about what these beliefs actually did, how they functioned in the context of winter survival, what role they played in helping people manage real dangers. Consider what lightning actually is in a plains environment, setting aside modern understanding of electrical discharge and thinking instead about the immediate physical experience. It's a genuine threat, a sudden discharge of electricity from cloud to ground, following the path of least resistance, seeking out anything that projects upward from the flat landscape. A teepee, with its poles extending 15 or 20 feet into the air, with its peak often the highest point for considerable distance across flat prairie, becomes exactly such a projection, a potential lightning target. And a direct strike on a teepee could be catastrophic. Poles could explode from the sudden heat, the moisture inside them flash boiling and blowing the wood apart like a small bomb. Hide covering could ignite, transforming the shelter into an inferno in seconds. People inside could be killed instantly by the electrical current or suffer burns and injuries that might prove fatal in the days that followed, infections spreading in wounds that had no access to modern medicine. So the danger was real, measurable, not imaginary or exaggerated for dramatic effect. The question is how people conceptualized and managed that danger, how they thought about something that was both predictable, it happened during storms, and random. Any particular tipi might be struck or spared without apparent reason. And here, the thunder being framework reveals itself as surprisingly practical, as functional rather than merely symbolic. If lightning is the action of powerful entities who can be addressed, who can be shown respect, who can potentially be influenced through proper behavior, then you have a framework for action, for agency, for the sense that you're not simply passive victims of random chance, but active participants in managing your relationship with dangerous forces. This doesn't mean the beliefs were scientifically accurate in a modern sense, doesn't mean thunder beings exist as literal entities you could capture and study, measure and predict with instruments. But the behavioral outcomes of believing in them were entirely practical, led to actions that genuinely reduced risk. Remaining quiet during storms, avoiding unnecessary movement or loud speech, created conditions where people could better hear approaching danger, could notice shifts in wind or changes in the storm's intensity that might signal increased lightning risk. Avoiding actions that might draw attention, not pointing at lightning, not speaking disrespectfully about storms, reduced the likelihood that people would stand outside during dangerous moments, reduced exposure to the precise circumstances when strikes occurred. Treating lightning-struck objects as powerful and dangerous, handling them carefully or avoiding them entirely, meant people approached struck trees or other objects with caution rather than rushing to investigate while storm conditions persisted and additional strikes remained possible. Moreover, objects struck by lightning, stones that showed the characteristic melting and fusing that comes from exposure to extreme heat, wood that showed burning patterns, were collected and treated as sacred items, as objects imbued with the power of thunder beings. Modern analysis shows that lightning can indeed transform stone through heat, can create fulgurite when it strikes sand, tubes of fused glass running underground along the path the electrical current followed. It can alter the magnetic properties of iron-bearing rocks, can leave permanent changes that are detectable with sensitive instruments. So the physical effects that plains peoples attributed to thunder being contact were real, observable phenomena, changes in material properties that anyone could see and feel. The interpretive framework was different from modern physics. The explanation involved entities and agency rather than voltage and amperage, but the observations underlying it were accurate. Lightning did change things, did leave traces, did transform ordinary objects into something different. The fact that modern science explains these changes through electromagnetic theory rather than spiritual entities doesn't invalidate the original observation that something profound had occurred. There's a particular mystery surrounding what archaeologists call lightning stones, small rocks found in burial contexts or in collections of medicine objects, showing evidence of having been struck by lightning, displaying the characteristic fusion or magnetic alteration that marks them as different from ordinary stones. The mystery is not whether lightning can do this to rocks, we know it can reproduce similar effects in laboratory conditions, but how people found these stones, how they located specific objects that had been struck during storms. Lightning strikes a specific point on the prairie, perhaps during a storm when visibility is near zero, when rain falls so heavily that anything more than a few feet distant disappears into grey obscurity, when the exact location would be impossible to mark with any precision. The struck stone would simply lie among millions of other stones scattered across the landscape, looking from a distance identical to any other stone, distinguishable only through close examination or handling. Yet people found them not occasionally, but regularly enough that lightning stones appear across a wide geographic range, in contexts spanning centuries, in burial sites and medicine bundles from diverse groups and time periods. How? Did they return to strike locations after storms cleared, searching systematically through the area where lightning had been seen to hit, examining stones one by one until they found one that showed signs of transformation? Did they notice changes in vegetation or soil that marked strike points, areas where the electrical discharge had killed grass or altered the surface in ways that remained visible for days or weeks after the storm? Did they have some technique for detecting the altered magnetic properties of struck stones, some method of dowsing or detection that left no physical record but was nonetheless effective, some sensitivity to magnetic fields that modern people have lost or never developed? The questions multiply, but answers remain scarce, speculative at best. We know that lightning stones were found and valued, know that they played roles in spiritual practices and were buried with individuals for whom they held particular significance. But the practical techniques of locating them remain mysterious. And this unknowing is important to acknowledge because it represents a gap in our understanding not just of technique, but of the broader question of how indigenous knowledge systems worked, how information was transmitted across generations, how expertise developed in the absence of formal institutions. The assumption that all human knowledge must follow the path Western science followed, observation, hypothesis, experimentation, formal theory expressed in mathematical language, is itself a kind of cultural blindness, an inability to recognize that there might be other ways of knowing, other valid approaches to understanding the world that don't fit neatly into categories we recognize. Perhaps there were observational skills developed through lifelong attention to landscape, through spending every day moving through terrain and noticing patterns that escaped casual observers. Perhaps there were teaching methods that transmitted knowledge through story and demonstration rather than abstract explanation. Perhaps there were individuals who specialized in particular kinds of knowledge, who became experts in reading weather or tracking animals or recognizing significant stones, and whose expertise was recognized and utilized by the broader community. Sleep itself was understood differently in this context, was not simply the physiological state modern medicine describes, but something more complex, more significant. The modern Western view treats sleep as primarily a physiological necessity, a period of unconsciousness during which the body rests and repairs itself, during which the brain consolidates memories and performs necessary maintenance functions. But Plains cultures viewed sleep as an active state, a time when different kinds of experiences became possible, when the boundary between physical and spiritual reality became permeable, when contact with aspects of existence that remained hidden during waking hours might occur. Dreams were not dismissed as mere brain activity during rest, not written off as random neural firing or subconscious processing of daily experiences. They were treated as meaningful experiences, as potential sources of information or guidance, as encounters with aspects of reality not accessible during waking hours. A dream during a storm might be interpreted as communication from the thunder beings, as message or warning or revelation that required attention. A recurring dream might be understood as a vision requiring interpretation, as indication that something significant was attempting to make itself known. And the line between sleeping and waking was itself less sharp, less definitively marked than modern thought tends to make it, less an absolute binary than a spectrum of consciousness, states that shaded into one another. The state of half-waking that comes when tending a fire in the middle of the night, the drowsy alertness of someone listening for danger while not fully conscious, the hypnagogic imagery that appears in the moments between waking and sleeping, these in-between states were recognized as real and significant, as places where certain kinds of knowing became possible. There's archaeological evidence that supports this different relationship to sleep and dreams, that suggests these beliefs were embedded in material practice rather than existing only as abstract concepts. Burial goods sometimes include objects associated with sleep and dreaming, particular stones or herbs or carved items whose presence suggests they played a role in sleep rituals or dream practices, that they were tools for navigating the landscape of sleep rather than mere decorations or markers of status. And site layouts sometimes show orientations of tipis, of sleeping places within tipis, that suggest deliberate alignment with astronomical features or geographical landmarks, suggesting that even the direction one slept might have been significant, might have influenced the quality or content of dreams. A person sleeping with their head toward the east might dream differently than one oriented west. A tipi entrance facing a particular mountain or star might affect the experiences of those sleeping inside. But again, we encounter the limits of what physical evidence can tell us, the boundary beyond which archaeology cannot pass, no matter how sophisticated its methods become. You cannot excavate a dream, cannot recover from ancient soil the subjective experience of someone sleeping 5 centuries ago. You cannot carbon date a vision, cannot subject spiritual experiences to the kind of empirical analysis that works for stone tools and fire pits. The interior experiences of people sleeping in tipis during winter storms 500 years ago are gone, accessible now only through the attenuated chain of oral tradition and the written accounts of observers who often lacked the cultural framework to understand what they were seeing. What we can say is that sleep in these conditions was never simple unconsciousness, never the 8-hour blocks of uninterrupted rest that modern sleep hygiene recommends as optimal. It was segmented, interrupted, punctuated by fire tending and smoke flap adjustment, and the sudden waking that comes when some sound or change registers as potentially dangerous, when instinct overrides fatigue and snaps consciousness back to alertness. Someone had to wake periodically to add fuel to the fire, to prevent it from dying and leaving the family in deadly cold. Someone had to monitor smoke accumulation, to adjust ventilation before conditions became dangerous. Someone had to listen for sounds that might indicate threats, animals approaching camp, weather deteriorating, other people moving outside. And in these fragments of sleep, these in-between states of partial consciousness and partial waking, perhaps people did experience things we would categorize as dreams, but they understood as something more, something other, something that blurred the boundary between inner and outer experience. The practice of segmented sleep, of sleeping in multiple shorter periods rather than one long stretch, was likely not a deprivation, but a different pattern, one that human beings may have followed for most of evolutionary history before artificial lighting made it possible to stay awake long after sunset. Winter in a tipi enforced this pattern, made continuous sleep impossible, required a rhythm of waking and sleeping that followed the fire's needs rather than abstract schedules. And in that rhythm, in the cycling between consciousness and unconsciousness that happened multiple times each night, people may have entered states that modern sleepers rarely experience, states where the boundaries of self became fluid, where individual consciousness merged with something larger or touched something deeper. The darkness of a winter tipi, broken only by firelight, creates sensory conditions very different from modern bedrooms. The sounds of wind and distant animals, the smell of smoke and hide, and the sharp scent of extreme cold, the physical sensation of cold air on the face while the body remains warm under buffalo robes, these create an environment where ordinary consciousness might shift more easily than in the controlled, familiar spaces where most modern people sleep. The cold itself affects consciousness, affects the border between sleeping and waking in ways that are difficult to describe, but unmistakable to anyone who has experienced them. There is a particular quality to thoughts in extreme cold, a sharpness and clarity combined with a strange remoteness, as if consciousness becomes more alert and more detached simultaneously. The body's response to cold, the vasoconstriction that draws blood toward the core, the shivering that generates heat through muscle activity, creates physical sensations that prevent deep sleep while not quite constituting wakefulness. And in that state, in the cold alertness that comes during winter nights, people may have found it easier to remain aware of dreams, to maintain some thread of consciousness even as they slept, to navigate the landscape of sleep with more intention than is usually possible. The shamanic practices of some cultures deliberately induced altered states through cold exposure, understanding that physical extremes could shift consciousness in useful ways. Whether Plains peoples consciously used cold this way or simply adapted to its presence is unclear, but the effect would have been similar. A winter night in a tipi kept people in states of consciousness that modern people rarely visit. The mystery, in the end, is not just about engineering or survival techniques, not just about how tipis functioned mechanically or how people stayed warm through blizzards. It's about consciousness itself, about how people experience being human in conditions so removed from modern comfort that we struggle to imagine them as anything but misery, anything but desperate survival devoid of meaning or beauty. But they were not just miserable, not merely surviving in the grimly minimal sense that word suggests. They were alive, were thinking and feeling and dreaming, were creating meaning and building cultures and passing on knowledge that allowed their descendants to survive and eventually thrive. They told stories around winter fires, stories that preserved history and transmitted values and created the frameworks through which children understood their place in the world. They made tools and art, worked leather and quill, created objects of beauty and utility during the long hours when weather confined them indoors. They maintained relationships, negotiated conflicts, fell in love, and raised children and mourned the dead. They laughed and argued and made decisions about where to move when winter ended. They experienced the full range of human emotion and thought, lived complete lives even in conditions that we would consider barely habitable. The tipi was not a cage or a prison, not a place of mere suffering, but a home, a space made meaningful through habitation, through the accumulation of memories and experiences that transform mere shelter into something more. And on certain winter nights, when the wind howls and the temperature plummets and you're trying to sleep despite the cold, if you listen carefully enough, you might almost hear them, the voices of all those generations sleeping in hide lodges, breathing smoke and cold air, enduring and persisting and finding ways to rest, even when rest seemed impossible. They're there in the space between waking and sleeping, in the moment when consciousness loosens its grip and you drift toward dreams, in that twilight country where the boundaries of time become permeable. Not as ghosts or spirits, not as supernatural presences requiring belief in things beyond the physical, but as memory, as the accumulated weight of human experience encoded in genes and stories, and the stubborn fact of your own existence. Every person alive today whose ancestors survived on the plains carries something of those winter nights, carries the genetic inheritance of people who could sleep in cold, who could wake when needed, who could manage the precise balance between rest and alertness that winter survival required. You are here because they slept and woke and slept again through 10,000 winters, through storms that would have killed lesser people, through nights that tested the limits of human endurance and revealed capacities that ordinary comfort never calls forth. You exist because someone hundreds or thousands of years ago woke in darkness to tend a fire, fought through exhaustion to add fuel and adjust smoke flaps and keep their family alive through one more night. And they did it again the next night, and the night after, through entire winters when spring seemed impossibly distant. And in that persistence, in that refusal to surrender to cold and darkness, in the daily acts of maintenance and care that kept life continuing when giving up would have been so much easier, they earned something more than survival. They earned the right to be remembered, to have their knowledge recognized as genuine understanding rather than lucky accident, to be seen not as primitives barely scraping by, but as experts in a kind of survival that required intelligence and courage and a deep, abiding competence. They deserve nothing less than profound respect, nothing less than acknowledgement that what they knew was real knowledge, that how they lived demonstrated mastery of their environment rather than helpless subjection to it. The tipi was not a primitive dwelling, but a sophisticated solution, one that worked precisely because it was designed by people who understood their world with a completeness that no amount of formal education can replicate, who knew, through lived experience, what modern science can only approximate through theory and experiment. And in the quiet moments, in the spaces between words and thoughts, their presence remains, not supernatural, but real, the way all human history remains real, the way the past persists in shaping the present, even when we're unaware of it. They are in the capacity to endure cold, in the ability to find comfort in harsh conditions, in the knowledge that human beings can adapt to almost anything if given time and necessity. They are in the recognition that survival is not just physical but mental, not just about staying alive but about maintaining humanity, about preserving the things that make life worth living even when living itself becomes difficult. The winter tipi stands as testament to this truth, as evidence that humans have always been more than their immediate circumstances suggested, that the capacity for intelligent adaptation runs deeper than technology or formal education, and in studying it, in trying to understand how it worked and why it succeeded, we might learn something not just about history, but about ourselves, about capacities we still possess but rarely need to use, about knowledge that persists in forms we no longer recognize but remains available if we learn to see it again. Not all tipis were equal, and not all families slept with the same degree of discomfort. This is a truth that complicates the narrative, that requires us to acknowledge that even in societies we romantically imagine as egalitarian, privilege existed, and that privilege manifested in very material ways when storms came howling across the winter prairie. The distinction was not wealth in the way modern people understand it. There were no bank accounts, no accumulated currency, no real estate holdings that generated passive income. But there was status, earned through different means, spiritual authority, proven bravery in warfare, successful leadership in hunts, or the simple accident of birth into a family with prestige and its associated obligations. And that status translated into advantages when winter made survival a daily negotiation. A high-status family's tipi might be 20 feet across instead of 15, might use 20 or even 30 lodge poles instead of the dozen that sufficed for a common family's shelter. This was not mere ostentation. The larger diameter meant more floor space, which meant more distance between sleeping areas and cold walls, which meant measurably warmer sleeping conditions. The additional poles created a more stable frame, better able to resist high winds, less likely to fail catastrophically when storms tested structural limits. The hides covering these elite lodges were superior as well. Prime buffalo hides from animals taken in their best condition, carefully processed to maintain maximum flexibility and water resistance, doubled in the winter configuration so that a full 2 layers of hide separated interior from exterior. Where a common family might make do with one good outer covering and a thin, patched inner liner, high-status families could afford the full double-wall construction that made such a dramatic difference in livability, and there were other material advantages less visible but equally significant. More buffalo robes for sleeping, not the minimum necessary, but an abundance allowing for layering, for creating genuine warmth rather than merely survivable cold. Bear skins, rare and precious, might supplement buffalo robes, providing superior insulation at the cost of additional weight and bulkiness. Beaver pelts, otter skins, the furs of smaller animals whose taking required specialized knowledge and technique, these might appear as supplemental bedding, as extra layers in moccasins, as the difference between fingers that remained functional through the night and fingers that went numb and painful with cold. Firewood supply favored the elite as well. A high-status family could command additional labor. Younger relatives, families indebted through complex webs of reciprocal obligation, individuals seeking to demonstrate their reliability and worth. This meant fuel gathering was not a constant worry but a managed task, ensuring that stacked wood always waited near the entrance, that the fire could burn steadily through the night without the anxiety of dwindling supply, forcing impossible choices between warmth and waste. But the deepest privilege was perhaps the most invisible, the presence of dedicated firekeepers. In a common family, everyone rotated through the fire-tending responsibility, everyone sacrificed sleep, everyone endured the jarring transition from warm robes to cold air multiple times per night. But in an elite lodge, there might be a young relative, a nephew, a younger brother, someone establishing their place in the family hierarchy, whose role was specifically to maintain the fire through the night, allowing others to sleep more deeply, more continuously, with fewer interruptions. This young person would sleep lighter near the fire, responsible for adding wood, for adjusting coals, for ensuring that heat production remained constant through the dark hours. It was a position of trust, but also of hardship. You slept less, worked more, endured greater discomfort. But it was also a position within a high-status household, a place where you learned by proximity to power, where you observed how decisions were made and how authority was exercised, where you built relationships that might eventually translate into your own elevated position. The spiritual dimension of elite status manifested especially clearly in the relationship to storms and lightning. While common families responded to thunder with quiet respect and the hope that they would pass unnoticed, families of medicine keepers or spiritual authorities often held a different understanding. For them, storms were not just dangers to be endured, but potential opportunities for encounter with power, moments when the boundary between ordinary and sacred became thin and permeable. A medicine keeper's lodge might be positioned deliberately at the camp's center, not on the periphery where wind was fiercest and danger greatest. This central position was both practical and symbolic. Practical because surrounding lodges provided some windbreak and buffer. Symbolic because the spatial arrangement reflected spiritual geography, with the most important families occupying the most protected locations. During storms, these families might perform specific rituals, not the elaborate public ceremonies of summer, but private family practices designed to maintain proper relationship with the forces manifesting in weather. Herbs might be burned, specific prayers might be spoken, particular objects might be arranged or handled in prescribed ways, and these practices, whatever their objective efficacy, created a sense of agency, of doing something rather than simply enduring, of being in relationship with the storm rather than merely subject to its violence. There are accounts passed down through oral tradition and later recorded by anthropologists of lightning strikes on medicine lodges being interpreted not as disasters but as confirmations of power, as dangerous blessings that elevated rather than destroyed. A lodge struck by lightning might be abandoned temporarily, but would be understood as having been touched by sacred power, as having received a kind of initiation that marked it and its inhabitants as special. The objects created by lightning strikes, wood showing characteristic burning patterns, stones fused or fractured by intense heat, soil melted into glassy formations, would be collected and incorporated into medicine bundles, those collections of sacred items that held power and meaning for families and individuals. These lightning-touched objects were not curiosities or decorations. They were understood as carrying actual power, as having been transformed through contact with forces beyond human control, as bridges between the ordinary and extraordinary realms of experience. But we must be careful not to overstate the protection that status provided. A larger teepee was still made of hide and wood, still vulnerable to the same forces that threatened smaller lodges. More buffalo robes made you warmer, but not invulnerable. A dedicated firekeeper reduced your personal burden, but didn't eliminate the fundamental precariousness of winter survival. And lightning, when it struck, discriminated based on physics rather than social hierarchy. The tallest lodge poles, whether they belonged to medicine keepers or common families, drew strikes with equal indifference. Indeed, there's a certain fragility to elite status in nomadic cultures that's easy for settled agricultural peoples to miss. Your prestige depended on your ability to fulfill obligations, to demonstrate generosity, to maintain the relationships that created your elevated position. A bad winter could deplete resources. A failed hunt could undermine your reputation for providing. And the mobility required by plains life meant that you couldn't accumulate possessions beyond what could be transported. Your teepee might be larger, but it still had to fold and pack, still had to be erected and struck with each camp move, still had to remain light enough that dogs or horses could drag it across the prairie. Moreover, the responsibilities of high status were real and demanding. A medicine keeper's family didn't simply enjoy advantages, they were expected to provide services, to maintain sacred objects properly, to perform rituals that benefited the entire community, to advise on spiritual matters, to interpret dreams and omens. A war leader's family gained prestige from victories, but bore the weight of decisions that cost lives, that determined whether people ate or starved, that positioned the camp in locations that proved wise or disastrous when winter storms arrived. And when storms came, when the night turned violent, and the teepee walls cracked under wind pressure, when hail threatened to tear through, hide and cold drove inward with killing intent. In those moments, the gap between elite and common narrowed considerably. Everyone was sleeping in the same material structures, everyone was subject to the same weather, everyone was fundamentally at the mercy of forces that didn't care about social distinction. There's a story recorded in the early 20th century from an elderly Lakota woman about a winter storm that collapsed several lodges, including that of a prominent family. The storm came suddenly, with winds that exceeded anything in recent memory, and the lodge poles, even the thick, carefully selected poles of the medicine keeper's large teepee, snapped like kindling. The family escaped injury, but lost much of their material wealth, their carefully accumulated buffalo robes buried in snow and hide, their food stores scattered, their prestige temporarily shattered by the visible evidence that they, too, could be humbled by nature's power. What the story emphasizes is how the community responded. Other families provided shelter, shared food, helped recover what could be saved. And this response wasn't seen as exceptional charity, but as the expected behavior, as the fulfillment of the reciprocal obligations that bound the community together. The medicine keeper's family had provided services when able, now others provided assistance when needed. The storm had demonstrated what everyone already knew at some level, that survival was communal, that no family was truly independent, that the illusion of security created by status was just that, an illusion that could be torn away as easily as wind tearing through hide. The contrast between elite and common, then, was real but not absolute. It was difference within shared vulnerability, advantage within common precariousness. The medicine keeper's children slept warmer than the common family's children, but they still slept in hide lodges on frozen ground, still breathed smoke-laden air, still woke to tend fires, still endured the essential discomfort of winter on the plains. And in the deepest part of night, when the storm was at its worst and sleep came in fragments between fire tending and worry, perhaps the difference narrowed to nothing. Perhaps the medicine keeper, lying beneath his bearskin robes in his large lodge, experienced the same fundamental human response to cold and danger that the youngest common family's child experienced. That animal awareness that you are small and vulnerable, that the forces arrayed against you are vast and indifferent, that survival is never guaranteed, but only achieved through constant attention and effort. The elite in this context were not a separate class living in different conditions. They were the same people, facing the same challenges with somewhat better tools and somewhat more support, but still fundamentally engaged in the same struggle. And this perhaps is why oral traditions from plains cultures rarely emphasize material differences between families in winter survival accounts. The stories that were told, the knowledge that was passed down, focused on what everyone needed to know: how to read storms, how to maintain fires, how to position smoke flaps, how to remain calm when circumstances argued for panic. Because in the end, the storm tested everyone equally. It found every weakness, exploited every gap, pushed every structure to its limits. And whether you were medicine keeper or common hunter, whether your lodge had 20 poles or 12, whether you slept on bearskins or plain buffalo robes, you still had to solve the same problems, still had to balance heat and smoke and cold, still had to endure the night, and wake to face the next day's work. The privilege of status brought you degrees of comfort, but not certainty. It provided advantages, but not guarantees. And this fundamental equality before nature's power created a kind of social leveling that no amount of accumulated prestige could entirely overcome. You were all, in the most literal sense, in the same boat, or rather the same tipi, riding out the same storm, hoping to see the same dawn. The sun rises now on that winter camp, and the world has been transformed. Snow lies deep across the prairie, sculpted by wind into drifts and hollows, covering all but the tallest landmarks. The storm has passed, moving east toward the river and beyond, leaving behind a silence so complete it seems to have weight, seems to press against the ears with its absence of sound. Inside the tipi, Watiwi and her family are stirring, emerging from buffalo robes into cold air made visible by breath, beginning the day's necessary tasks with the quiet efficiency of people who have performed these same actions countless times before. The fire is rekindled, snow is gathered for melting, hides are checked for damage. Life continues because it must, because there is no alternative, because survival is not a single dramatic act, but an endless succession of small, mundane, essential tasks. And across the camp, in dozens of other lodges, other families are doing the same, are emerging into the same cold dawn, are facing the same work. The common and the elite, the young and the old, the strong and the frail, all moving through the same rhythm, all participants in the same ancient dance of survival that their ancestors performed and their descendants will perform generation after generation, winter after winter, until the world changes in ways they cannot imagine, and the tipi becomes a memory rather than a home. We have journeyed tonight into that memory, have tried to understand what it meant to sleep when sleep was never certain, when warmth was always threatened, when the simple act of closing your eyes and surrendering to rest required more courage than most modern people will ever need to display. We've felt perhaps some echo of that cold, some shadow of that vulnerability, some distant sense of what it was to be human before central heating and insulated walls and weather forecasts that warned you days in advance of approaching storms. And what have we learned? That comfort is not natural, not the default human condition, but something achieved through effort and ingenuity and the accumulated knowledge of generations. That the peoples we once dismissed as primitive were in fact sophisticated engineers, solving problems of thermodynamics and structural stability with tools and materials that would seem laughably inadequate to modern builders, but which proved sufficient when applied with skill and understanding. That sleep, which we treat as a simple biological necessity, was once a more complex experience, fragmented, interrupted, interwoven with responsibilities and awareness, a state that blurred the boundaries between consciousness and unconsciousness, between individual and community, between physical and spiritual experience. That rest was earned rather than assumed, achieved rather than expected, a small daily victory rather than an automatic right. But perhaps most importantly, we've learned something about human resilience, about the capacity of our species to adapt to conditions that seem impossible until you've lived through them long enough that they become simply life. The peoples of the plains didn't sleep in tipis through winter storms because they were unusually tough or uniquely capable. They did it because circumstances demanded it, because that was the life they were born into, and because the alternative to adapting was death. And they not only survived but thrived, building rich cultures, developing sophisticated technologies, creating art and music and stories that carried meaning and beauty. They were not merely enduring hardship, they were living full human lives, experiencing joy and sorrow, love and loss, triumph and failure, all within a context that would seem to us unbearably harsh, but to them was simply the world as it existed, the only world they knew. You, lying now in your own bed, in your own heated room, separated from outdoor cold by walls and insulation and the miracle of modern climate control, you are the inheritor of their persistence. You exist because they endured. Your comfort is built on their discomfort, your ease purchased by their effort, your certainty of warm sleep earned by their uncertain sleep on frozen ground, beneath buffalo robes in hide lodges that swayed and creaked and sometimes failed when storms grew too violent to survive. This is not to romanticize their hardship or to suggest that modern comfort is somehow less valuable because it was achieved rather than always present. But it is to say that remembering is important, that understanding where we came from matters, that honoring the knowledge and courage of those who came before is not just an exercise in historical curiosity, but a recognition of debt, of continuity, of the long chain of human experience that connects us across time to every person who ever lay down to sleep in uncertainty and woke to face another day of necessary work. The teepee stands empty now in this moment you've been imagining. Dawn has fully arrived and the camp is alive with activity, with smoke rising from multiple lodges, with the sounds of dogs barking and children playing in new snow, with the ordinary bustle of life continuing. But the teepee itself, that cone of hide and poles that sheltered a family through the night's fury, stands quiet, patient, waiting for the next night when it will again become a refuge, a shelter, a thin barrier between human vulnerability and nature's indifference. And if you listen carefully in that quiet space between waking and sleeping that you're drifting toward now, you might hear something, not voices exactly, not sounds you could record or measure, but presence, memory, the accumulated weight of 10,000 nights of sleep in conditions you've tried to imagine tonight, of 10,000 families making the same choices Watiwi made, solving the same problems, enduring the same cold, finding the same small comforts in fire and closeness, and the stubborn human refusal to surrender to circumstances. They are there in your breathing, in the rhythm of your heartbeat, in the genetic code that built your body according to patterns refined through generations of survival. They are there in your ability to rest despite uncertainty, to close your eyes and trust that you will wake, to surrender consciousness in the faith that the world will still exist when you return to it. Sleep now with gratitude for the warmth that surrounds you, for the walls that hold back wind, for the certainty that you will wake comfortable rather than cold, rested rather than exhausted. Sleep with some small acknowledgement of those who slept before you, who made your ease possible through their endurance, who passed down not just genes but knowledge, not just life, but the skills and wisdom that made life worth living even in its hardest moments. The prairie wind is quieting. The stars are fading as dawn spreads across the sky. Somewhere in the memory of the world, a tipi stands against the horizon, smoke rising from its crown, families sleeping inside, safe for now, surviving, persisting, living. And you are connected to that tipi, to that family, to that moment of precarious safety, by threads invisible but unbreakable, by the simple fact of your existence and the long, difficult journey that brought human life from those frozen plains to this moment now, to this warm bed, to this quiet invitation to rest. Let go now. Let the history drift away. Let the cold recede into memory where it belongs. Let yourself sink into sleep, into the darkness that is no longer dangerous, into the rest that your ancestors earned for you through 10,000 nights of endurance. They survived so that you could sleep peacefully. And in sleeping peacefully, you honor them, you justify their struggle, you prove that it was all worthwhile, the cold, the fear, the exhaustion, the endless work of staying alive. Good night. Sleep well. And when you wake, remember for just a moment the teepee standing on the frozen prairie, the family breathing in smoke-scented air, the fire burning low but steady, the buffalo robes heavy with the weight of human warmth, the wind outside speaking its ancient language of storm and survival, and the deep, patient rhythm of seasons cycling through their eternal dance. Remember and be grateful and rest.